you were then talking about working with your brother at the Smithsonian in Washington, and the way in which with the African American Museum, there was this need to create a space for the visitor to pause, and that, you know, if they were going to be looking at all of these objects, some of which were incredibly difficult to process and were going to kind of that the directors and the curators and the people working in the museum knew that there would be this emotion with this material objects. And you talked about this space. So I've never been to the Museum of Washington, still want to go, but I had this image in my mind of this space that you showed me and described to me that had water and sound, and that there would be this kind of place in the museum to reboot and to kind of think again. And you talked about how sound is part of that environment, part of that way of shifting mood. And then another piece that I did go to Oslo to the museum of the Nobel Peace Prize Museum, where you did an installation there, didn't you, with all the Nobel Peace Prize winners, and again thinking about environment. And then when I started working at Greenwich, I invited you to the Queen's House, which is sort of seen as the first classical building in England designed by somebody who becomes an architect, Inigo Jones, who is in the right place at the right place at the right time in Stuart, London, and sort of is a designer for performance and who moves into architecture. And I just had this gut feeling that you'd quite like the Great Hall in the Queen's House. So maybe it'd be good for you to say about what your initial memory of the sonic space of the Great Hall at the Queen's House is.
The first impression of the sonics.
Or the space, whichever,
yeah.
what comes first? The sonic, the space, the emotion.
I guess it all kind of follows each other. Beautiful space, incredible geometric cube, very enthralling, just instant captivation, and the views directly to the Thames from the windows of this perfectly symmetrical Great Hall. It's so powerful. Yeah, instantly transfixed. You had me straight away.
and it's a perfect cube, and there's something kind of incredibly modern about, well, I mean, it is like the first modern building arguably, but you have this cube, and you have these apertures, and you have light coming through, and I think we had a sort of conversation about, you know, you can almost think about how the Queen's House is being built roughly at the same time as the Taj Mahal. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I suppose, to sort of jump into where we're going to go is to think about stories that are untold or undertold or kind of beneath the surface. And I suppose the story of Western architecture is to think about Inigo Jones going to Italy, discovering Palladian architecture and these kind of Vitruvian principles of the relationship of the body to geometry. But obviously that isn't something that's a purely Western idea. And I do remember you kind of immediately getting into the geometry, and, you know, you are also a mathematician, aren't you? So is there anything that you'd like to say about the geometry of spaces or the culture of geometry?
Well, there's certainly, I have a love for history, but I also have a deep love for mathematics. Obviously, I love music as well and sounds, but yeah, for me, there's an intrinsic link between mathematics and sounds, and mathematics and and obviously buildings as well, and these objects, these buildings, in terms of geometry, as you just said. And there's a thing called the golden ratio, which is incredibly important, which is a sort of aesthetic of mathematical beauty in regards to proportions, which is what's built into the Pantheon and these incredible sort of Greek architecture, and obviously into sort of Italian architecture, and from the Great Pyramids. It's something that appears a lot, and that's also in relation, funny enough, to the Peruvian man. You know, there's proportions between the elbow to the fingers. There's this golden ratio. The proportions between, you know, the nose to the chin, from the head to the is a golden ratio. And in music, the scales in music, the relationship between different notes in terms of frequency is a golden ratio. So there's the golden ratio seems to be an aesthetic about nature, about what is beautiful, what is considered beautiful. And some reason nature already purported this mathematical equation and solved it, you know.
So that takes us back to, you know, how everyone's going to make any sense of what's on the screen. But you composed a piece that was a call and response that was to be sung as part of a procession. And it used very simple language. It's kind of, what do you call it? Like a phonetic.
Phonetic.
Like a phonetic.
Yeah, phonetics, yeah.
It used phonetics, really. But you said that the condition that brought it together was that, and I know nothing about music, is that it was all in C, and that's the most natural frequency on the planet, and that everybody can find the tone of musical C, whatever voice, whatever language.
Specifically middle C.
Middle C, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
Middle C.
Yeah.
So you know, compose this call and response in middle C as this kind of frequency that anybody could find a hold into, and that kind of really did start a discussion. And that was part of a piece that we could be here all night to talk about that. But I think the middle C became something else, like, over time, didn't it? It became something we developed, but also in terms of undertold stories, although thanks to David Olusogun, much more, and Michael Adjaye, much more told story is of the figure of John Blank, who, when this was the site that we are on right now, where the university is the site of the Tudor Palace, and where Henry VIII would hold his tournaments. And in the register of the royal trumpeters was this man, John Blank, who was a black man living in early 16th century London, who we know was in Greenwich. And that was another kind of figure that we discussed in terms of thinking about the deep roots of global culture, that were actually far more present in the 16th century than we perhaps remember or think about in terms of history books.
Yeah.
So we're just going. So that's kind of starting point. But I think it's also really important to, you know, no work ever sort of comes about in isolation. And at the same time as we were working on a proposal for radical hospitality, you were also working with Toyin on a site-specific installation in response to her paintings in the Curve Gallery.
Her drawings.
Her drawings in the Curve Gallery at the Barbican. And so there was already something kind of in the air that this is, I mean, you should say something about this piece.
The Toyin drawing.
Yeah.
So the exhibition of Toyin's at the Barbican Curve Gallery is called A Countervailing Theory. And it's a series of 40 drawings ranging from 7 foot tall to sort of, 3 feet tall and different sizes spread across this incredible curved gallery, and telling the story of a mythic ancient civilization of warrior women who basically were the rulers, and the humanoid men were slaves. And these powerful women with their rippling muscles was this complete imagination of Toyin's to create in this landscape called the Josh Plateau, which is this area that she had researched in the middle of the Nigeria, with this incredible landscape, which in parts resembles aspects of Stonehenge in terms of how those rock formations had been even moved, and how they managed to be sort of placed into these different sort of configurations, a really incredibly rich layered landscape. And she asked me to create a soundscape for this incredible work. And so I really spent my time sort of researching the landscape,
But we also talked about, this very, well, talking about gender and talking about women and their kind of role in society. And Toyin's is a kind of Afrofuturist imagined world to a certain extent. But on the left, this is Queen Nzinga, who is kind of a contemporary of Elizabeth I. And this is not a live drawing, but the story goes that when the Portuguese colonial local head honcho was having a meeting with Queen Nzinga,
there was no chair for her, was there?
There was no chair.
Yeah.
So she came in to have a meeting with him, and she was a diplomat, and she was coming to negotiate and she wanted to be eye to eye. And when she came in, the story is that there was a mat on the floor for her to sit on so that she would be beneath him. So she, clicked her fingers and told her servant to come into the room and to shape himself into a chair, so that she could have a conversation eye to eye.
Yeah.
So we were sort of having conversations about these powerful women within African society and the positions that they took. And then this is a map from the time, because again, rooting into the 16th century, that for the first time that the English sailors reached the Gold Coast, reached this coast of West Africa, was in the sort of middle of the 16th century, the 1550s. So I think I'm kind of rooting us into like how ways into where we got, where we're going.
And about power as well.
And about power. Everything was about power.
Yeah.
But to sort of get into really specifically why we came to make this installation was also, it was a question that came from a group of older adults that live locally, who I was working with in collaboration with Natasha Lohan, who's a vocalist, and Beth Peters, who's a dance specialist, and a practical philosopher, Aisha Delanarol. And we were asking a question of this group of women about whether it's possible to divide your public and your private self, and how people do that, and how they have done that in history, and how that is part of power, the kind of masks that we wear. But it was a project that was happening online, because it was in the middle of the pandemic and everybody was isolating. And it was a very particular moment where there was a lot of emotion anyway about being in isolation and learning to work on these digital platforms. But then, if somebody described it like a fire extinguisher going off, the brutal murder of George Floyd happened, and a couple of weeks later, the Colston statue was rolled into the Bristol Canal. And so this project and these conversations just went, I think everything was already there,
Mm.
but the conditions came for some questions really to be asked, which was something that was happening globally, wasn't it? It wasn't something new. George Floyd's death wasn't isolated. The anger about Colston wasn't just sparked in that moment. Everything was there, but
heightened.
But the moment came for the questions to be asked, and the question that I was asked was like, never mind the private and the public, and never mind the anxieties of this, figure of this iconic Queen Elizabeth I. What impact has this woman had on Britain and on British lives? And if you're dealing with an image like the Armada Portrait of Elizabeth I, that is a piece of propaganda about the desire for empire and power, what is that legacy? What is that? What is happening now? And that was when I came to you and said, I think we need to begin another response, and we need to look at this painting in a different way. Is this a so that's kind of the conditions of the project. That's a background to how we came to be having a conversation and how we'd started to kind of think about some things. We're all aware of the complexities, but I think finally the conversation really is being amplified now.
It's a good word, amplified.
I think that's so. Yeah, should we listen to something?
Well, the project that we came up with was called
A Proposal for Radical Hospitality.
Proposal for Radical Hospitality. Now we probably should explain what that means.
So I think the proposal, the proposal is a question. In some respects, I could talk about a proposal for radical hospitality being going back to that question, what impact? That at the point that question was asked, I stop being me, I stop being Matty, I become the institution, I represent the museum. So I have a responsibility there to go back to the institution and to say, and I did say, I think we must respond.
Yep.
And the particulars were that we had been in the middle of an exhibition where there were the three Armada portraits that exist in the world for the first time ever in over 400 years were brought together and were on display. And because of the pandemic, the museum closed to the public and everything changed. And one of the paintings had to go somewhere else. So there was, in theory, there was a gap. And the proposal was that you come in to make an installation and we create a response. And for me, the idea of hospitality, I'm going to leave the radical to you, but the idea of hospitality is the museum as host, and the museum as platform. And again, it's a question, can the museum be a radical host? Can it actually host some really difficult questions? And can it listen to what people think about its collection and some of the legacies of that collection? Can it gather that? So what's your radical hospitality?
I guess you covered most of the sort of, the structure of what we were talking about, but it was about being able to experiment in the space, in this museum space, to be able to bring in sound, by definition considered radical, especially in museum settings, or any other setting, I think sound can be a very powerful, provocation, whether it's about loudness or bass or just having sound present, because it's something that really affects people emotionally instantly. And a lot of people can feel an instant dislike to a sound, a particular sound situation, or like for it. So it's very powerful. So just that's using sound for me is that radical nature, and sound by definition for me is radical and rebellion, especially in institutions who really don't know how to work with sound in regards to structurally, architecturally, technology. It's just something that they just are, they have no understanding of, I guess. And I guess having the right kind of sound is really important. There's a lot of people that do sort of sound, and it's interesting to think how to bring a sound into a space that's sort of really proportionate and makes the point that it's supposed to make. So reacting to history, a particular history about a specific painting, the Armada Portrait, to bring other voices into the frame, if you like, using sound, using their voices to bring unheard voices, unheard stories into the legacy of the great portrait that is about the projection of England as this, very much the time when England was about to say we are, a strong seafaring nation, that we, and expanding its empire to be a colonial power. There was this story that felt that it was missing, these hidden voices that were part of this expansion without wit, without whose resources, whose culture, this colonial empire would not exist. This richness would not exist. There is no colonialism, colonial power. There is no empire. There's no wealth without the cultural collection of resources and ceremonies and people's culture that England took from India to Asia to Africa to Brazil to Cuba to the Caribbean. This is a rich history. And for that history not to be known as that description of what England's about, it's too monothematic. And it's very boring, to be exact. But really, I think young people really need to know what's happening. And actually what's happening is that there is no story that is just, England came and it created all these things. It was influenced by all this knowledge that had been passed on. And we're talking about knowledge from the Moors, which a lot of people need to kind of look up to, look into what the Moors were about, because they were a big influence into Europe about sort of navigation, about all kinds of things, mathematics, algebra, and they brought that from Egypt, and those
from India
and the Middle East. And people talk about this, England being this incredible seafaring nation, the Portuguese being the seafaring nation, and therefore able to create colonies and travel. But where did they get the ability to navigate from? Well, funny enough, they got it from the Moors, who brought it from Egypt. So it goes back to the origin. So it's not about saying everything is from this place. It's about showing a story that not everything's from Africa as such, in that way. But it's more about the story that we tell is that it's all linked. The world is linked, and that our stories are linked, and there's no separation. So when you look at the Armada Portrait, and you see Queen Elizabeth pointing to the Caribbean on the globe, she's talking about what she needs. She's got pearls. This very
well. It's a propaganda image which is about simplicity.
Yeah.
But I think the desire was to stay with the complexity and stay with that trouble, and just as we said, sort of amplify it. So the gift, in a way, was the fact that what we had was what I could offer, I suppose, or get access to, was the building.
Yeah.
And the building that's normally has people coming in every day was empty. So we had this unique opportunity to churn the building into a transmitter, was kind of what we were talking about, was that we obviously had to follow all these social distancing rules. So we had a very small number of performers, and we used the hall as a way to kind of capture all of this sound. And this is the tulip staircase, which was like our sort of cockpit, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So what was happening was that the sound, the people who were participating were coming into the house,
yeah,
through the tulip staircase.
our cockpit, yeah.
And this is Randolph Matthews, who, because there was this very deep sense of a call and response. It was a call, it was a response in terms of doing the project, and then it was literally about call and response. So somebody in their home would call in, and Randolph would respond out. And then what was happening was the sound was then, we had 6 speakers set up all around the Great Hall, and the sound was coming in. And then there were people in the hall who were listening to that sound and responding to the sound. So there was this...
Like an echo. Yeah, an echo of layers of responses upon responses upon responses, a call, a response, and then responding to that response. So there's lots of layers of how this works. I can't believe how we managed to do it, considering how the internet's so unreliable, but people were zooming in live, and interacting in another space with a percussionist and other musicians.
I think we should probably, this would be a really good time. Should we listen to a little extract from one of the pieces?
Yeah, so this is one of the pieces, 6 pieces that we did. And each one of the 6 pieces points to, I guess, a different sort of location for us in regards geographically, in terms of the sort of legacy that we're trying to bring in those cultures into. And actually, this is the actual culture and legacy of the people we specifically chose to be participants in this call and response. I think the process we did was incredibly unique, and we'll probably talk about it some more. But
there was you know, when we were, you know, actually looking at looking at the map of, are you in it? Yeah, start playing it.
Yeah.
That, you know, when we were looking at the Gulf of Guinea or this part of West Africa, and you know, we should absolutely say that you are British Ghanaian, that you are, it's an area that is very familiar to you. That I said, well, wouldn't it be amazing if we had, you know, if we could zoom to Accra, and could we have a drummer in Accra who would respond back to us? And we did talk about whether that would be possible, and you said there were some Wi-Fi issues. And then that was when I said...
So this piece is Randolph with the Voices of Motion Choir. Love this piece, and we'll talk about it after, I guess. Do you listen?
in the project, we, in the early part of the project, working with that group of older women, was how do you care or lean into people who are experiencing a profound effect of isolation in a moment of huge emotion, and if they're a very tight group that have been working together for a long time. And in the real world, if they were meeting in the space that they normally meet with the people that they work with, as a community, you lean in, you see somebody's struggling a bit or somebody needs somebody. But in a virtual world, how do you do that? And that was kind of happening in that moment in so many different ways. It's got nothing to do with age or gender or place. An enormous amount of people were trying to negotiate how do we relate to each other in this new world of the pandemic. And so there was this way in which, how could we make it possible that people could stay safe, stay in their living rooms, and yet come into the space with us?
Yep.
And so that's what you were listening to, was all of those women were sitting in their homes.
20 women?
I can't remember exactly how many there were, but and they were coming in, and Randolph was talking to them.
Yep.
And then Demba was the drummer, and he was listening, and they were responding, and then you were mixing and capturing all of those layers of sound together.
Yes.
And there were, there is a range of emotion, and there is a lot of footage, and we were condensing it down into these.
I think that session
chapters.
was probably about 2 hours long, and it ends up being about 9 minutes long after editing. But there's a lot of jiggery pokery that's done afterwards. But there was a live mixing of the 6 different microphones picking up all of this going on, all these different atmospheres mixing in different spaces, whether it's Randolph in the tulip atmosphere or Denver in the Great Hall atmosphere, and the atmosphere of every single one of those participants all mixed together to create this one atmosphere.
And there was, again, in this kind of like a tactic, I suppose, was somehow, finding something that's beyond language, that is a kind of connected sound in this maybe middle C, maybe phonetic, whatever it is for people in sound. But how can you draw people in to feel that they're all part of something?
Well, I think it's interesting because sound, I think, is sound is one of those things that is so intrinsic and so raw, but it's actually very exposing to sing, or to make some noises, right, or make some sound that's supposed to be about sort of sharing and singing, especially if you're not a trained singer. And these ladies aren't trained singers in any way, shape, or form. So the idea was to get them to be able to make noises that they've never made before, and to share that, and then to go public.
I think they're more practiced than that. I think they do that. But whereas
they do more choral things. Whereas this was more maybe. I
think they're more improvisation. Whereas the second chapter, which we should probably come onto, or we can build the contrast, that the London Likumi choir, who are an Afro-Cuban choir, who are focused on the kind of Orissa traditions from Nigeria. They very much are a choir. They're used to performing in a very conventional way as a choir, deeply rooted in a spiritual way, but a choir. They're not experimenting in a way that the other group were. But one of the reasons I wanted them to be part of it is, again, that they had worked with the museum and were working on International Slavery Remembrance Day. But I wanted them to become part of the building, not a procession or an event or a one-off. And some of them were in a garden in Muswell Hill. There was somebody in Canada, there was somebody in Sheffield. Again, they were kind of, and in the portal, there was a sort of a way in. But their music and their sound is very much about recovering these ancestors that are in the water, that are in the sea, that are in the Middle Passage, in the relationship between West Africa and the north of South America and the Caribbean, that they are through song bringing these ancestors back through the water.
Should we play it?
Yeah. So we had to kind of pull that into the space to record in the space was quite complicated.
It was a crazy, it's a bit of a nightmare actually. Zoom, I guess, Zoom doesn't allow you to. Basically, it's a syncing of Zoom in terms of everything being on time for us to be able to have that sort of connection. But Squadcast, which is a podcasting software, allows up to only a maximum of 4 different inputs.
Which we found out.
To our dismay. Only four outputs, but they're actually perfectly in sync because they're recorded at source, each single vocal. So because the Likumi were mostly one choir in Muswell Hill in the garden, and then like 8 people, that's one input. One in Montreux, whatever it was, that's one input. There was another one in somewhere else in London. Yeah. And so there was 5, like 8 there, 1 there, 1 there, 1 there, 4. And that allowed us to get a bit of a capture. But it was still quite hard to sort of get Demba, to the percussionist, to sync that. But then, it's all part of that jiggery-pokery that I do afterwards as well. But
so we've gone local, and then we were kind of going in this relationship mainly between Nigeria and Cuba through the ocean.
Yeah.
And then the next one was
Liz
Mira, who is a singer from Venezuela.
Yes, who's here. So Venezuelan singer, Liz Mira Zerpa. I invited her to join us. We wanted to have somebody from the South America, didn't we?
Well, I was particularly interested in Venezuela because in the portrait there's meant to be over 800 pearls, and pearls were, you talked about resources and material that kind of, again, these legacies and impact that the Spanish and the Portuguese sort of almost took every pearl from Venezuela in that moment, that this sort of taking from the land, and how that is also a dimension of what continues and shapes the world we're in now, is the mineral resources of place are quite extraordinary, really.
Well, it's what it's about. Should we ever listen to this one? Or?
Yeah.
Should we ever listen to this one? Okay. Across Asia as well, yeah, but yeah.
But they're such a symbol of luxury.
Yes, absolutely.
So the next place that we kind of stop off is again is kind of closer. But we've talked about how the painting is a projection of the kind of colonial ambition, but in the 16th century for the English, the proto-laboratory of colonialism is Ireland, and it's in Ireland that the English are enacting the model of suppressing language and culture. And it also, it's how the Spanish Armada is won, because the Spanish ships in the middle of a storm crash against the west coast of Ireland. So it's fate, it's God, it's a spell, but it is actually kind of a space within the painting.
Yeah.
And so the next chapter was with Natasha Lohan, and she was thinking both firstly of a tradition in the Irish language, but that exists, I think, in many cultures, but in Ireland it's called keening, that if somebody has died, you bring somebody to the space where the body is, where the wake is, and that person carries the emotion of the family, takes it somewhere through voice that again gives people a space to lean into, that to find where if there's kind of emotion in the community or in the family, how do you take that somewhere where people can find a place to join in? And I think that was something that was happening all the way through. And it was, again, to go back to this idea of what a radical hospitality was, it was also to flatten hierarchies, that if you're dealing with a museum, you're dealing with the knowledge, how could you shift the sort of the way in which you form a connection that isn't top down. And part of what was being kind of experimented with is, can you kind of take that away? Can you dissolve the kind of individuals in a way and begin to, like, you like bleeding, don't you? You like sound bleeding from one space into another. But I think there was, apart from leaning in and out, there was bleeding from one thing to another, and how people could each respond to, I think there is a kind of call in this moment for us to sort of find new language, perhaps. I think that's something that the pandemic has done, is to sort of provoke maybe other forms of emotion and language are required for this particular moment.
Absolutely. So this is Natasha.
And then the other person that she was really thinking about, again, in terms of these other models of leadership, other forms of leadership, rather than the sort of purely monarchical, is Granuaile, or Grace O'Malley, who was an Irish queen and who had all of her family had been brutally slaughtered, and she came to have an audience at Greenwich with Elizabeth I. She just said, right, I'm going to have, this is not going to happen. And she came to have, again, one of these very direct conversations. But in kind of English history, she's often seen as a pirate, as an outsider. But it's, where does authority or leadership come from? How is it made? And is it in the interaction, or is it in the projection? And then this is an example of, sort of from the period, an Irish lord, and the idea for the Tudors was that they were civilizing. They were bringing this kind of Roman order to a place that was full of savages. That was the condition. That was the idea, that this place of island needed to be civilized, and the English, in their projection, this was the job that they would do, and the first thing the first way of enacting that pressure is very often through language. And I think for many of the kind of colonial complexity we came up in every chapter, language is the root, isn't it?
Yeah. So this is Bird the Bird.
Oh, hang on, so moving into Bird the Bird, and Bird is from Liverpool, but she also wanted to talk about the experience of women and queer people, and the people who are dispossessed, the people who don't fit into the social order and then are banished or branded or rejected or subverted. And she wanted to kind of call on these different spirits, and she wanted to cast a spell over the painting and to take away from the main subject of the Queen. And she focused on, in the bottom right-hand corner, this idea of the mermaid, the siren that wrecks the ships, but also this figure that is beyond gender, and that is part of a different order of the world. And I think that in that early modern period, she talks a lot about the birth of capitalism, really. That's the other huge Elizabethan invention is the joint stock company, is the way in which people, that's how you get the Royal Africa Company and the East India Company, is this way in which people bring their capital together to play the long game, to bring back profit. So if you're outside of that system, if you make your money by working the land or giving sort of being a kind of doctor, or you're a kind of person who's offering something within your community, in a world that becomes ordered in terms of who will be a doctor, who will be a teacher, who will do what, but people are dispersed from that. And she wanted to trace how far back that goes. And in that period, you know, many women were burnt as witches because they didn't fit within the social order or convention. And then the final chapter was Randolph's, who kind of appears all of the way through. And Randolph is of Grenadinian heritage. And I put in this image of Steve McQueen's Carib's Leap, which is from 2002, which was a piece that he made in Grenada. Steve McQueen also has Grenadinian heritage. And Carib's Leap is about, in the middle of the 17th century, the last of the Caribs, or the Cameroons, when the French invaded, they decided they would rather take the leap into the ocean than be subjugated by the French. And I think Randolph was very interested, again, in this passage between places. And he was very much a part of each chapter, but it was very important, I think, that we made one that was just for him. Should we open it up to questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely incredible and fascinating. I think, first of all, what we'll do is we'll invite our friends who are joining us via the interweb. If you have any questions, please can you type them in the chat for us, and I will relay your questions. So while you guys on the internet have a think about what you'd like to ask, I'm going to call out to our friends in the room here and ask if anyone has any questions in. So while they're thinking then as well, I should ask the first question. I'm really interested then in the acoustics of the space.
Yeah.
You're channeling all of this audio from various sources into the location, and you mentioned that at the beginning there were people. It's just the musicians who are in the space who are receiving the transmissions from outside,
Yeah.
and then responding to them in there. And of course, we talked a little bit earlier on about the dimensions of the space and the acoustics of the space. Anyone who's been there will know, because you have this very equal proportions, you get these really nice reflections and acoustics. And I wondered whether those, to what extent those played back into the piece.
I think those kind of perfect proportions can sometimes be not so great acoustically. Funny enough, irregular spaces are better for acoustic sort of listening, because it sort of allows sound to disperse in different directions and not all in the same direction. Essentially, it wasn't doing that, but sometimes it can, if it's too perfect, in one area it can go wrong. But actually, sometimes it's about not fighting the acoustics, it's about working with the acoustics for me. And so that space had a particular sort of acoustic, what I call sound imprint. And Matty sort of, not laughs at me, but she does tell me, she always says about that I love bleeding, right? I love sound bleed. And I just love the idea of sound spilling out into spaces, because people are really scared of that. People try to spend all their time soundproofing spaces, and sometimes that's needed. There's no dialogue about actually why can't sound sometimes actually bleed, just like nature, right? You know, there's the bird coming towards you, there's a plane flying overhead, the train going under, your neighbors have an argument. It's normal. Sound bleeds, you know, but we try to create spaces that are, you know, sanitized with acoustic spaces that are like museums, right? Where if there's a sound, it's going to be contained or in a sort of experience, where actually sound is not natural, it being contained. It's actually designed to bleed, to spread out, to interact with each other. So a lot of my acoustic, if you like, the acoustics of the space, even the bleeding from the speakers back into the sort of tube staircase was fine. Even the sort of bleeding between musicians was great, because the microphones were picking up one from the balcony, one from each corner, and essentially what I was doing, I was mixing live. So I was controlling each speaker's volume in the space, depending on the performance and depending on how loud or how emotional the dynamics were, because it was like a 2-hour session for each project. So it was about sort of controlling that sound, making sure that nothing got too loud, and also then recording that sound at the same time. So it was a live imprint of that space. And yeah, acoustically, it was like a free improvisational jazz gig, you know.
So Randolph Matthews and Natasha Lohan and Brenda Montague were in the space. We were there for 2 days. So they were there both days. And Brenda was part of the Voices in Motion choir, but also worked for the museum. And then on the first day, Bird came into the space. And on the second day, Meera Chowder came into the space, who had also been working with the painting and the museum. So they were the people, and then Demba, the drummer, was there both days. So that was the tiny group that were there. So it built over time with the three, with Natasha and Randolph and Brenda. It kind of built that they were a kind of continuum, weren't they?
More
to the voices
came into the space, yeah.
that as people came in sort of via Zoom, they were there as these kind of continuing hosts. And hosts, weren't they? They were hosting the sound coming in, and they were a sort of, and they were a physical body to receive it, I think, as well. And to respond,
you talked a lot about, in a way, the making of the piece. What happens? There has been an audience at some point, or what will happen when the house will reopen to the public?
So it has been. Yeah. So the piece opened in September, and so we took that 2 days, and we're sort of unpacking the process. So when you go into the space, you have this curved wall with the 2 Armada portraits, and then the piece is split. There are 6 speakers across the architecture of the Queen's Presence Chamber, and so there are 6 chapters. If you listen to the whole thing, it's about sort of 45 minutes. 51. But most people who are coming into the space will always come in at a different moment, and we talked about, it was a decision to not have like a trip that you have a beginning and a mid. It was about how, sometimes you're standing, and some are louder and quieter. So sometimes you can come into the Great Hall and you can hear voices coming from a certain place. And because of the social distancing, there's a very specific, you have to go round in a particular way. So you sort of start in the Queen's Presence Chamber and you end in the King's Presence Chamber opposite. So there's a sense in which the sound a little bit travels, but in its installation terms, it's there to shift your perception.
I mean, it's installed as a 6-speaker installation in the Queen's Presence Chamber above the Great Hall for a while, I don't know, till February or something, but yeah, there's a whole other thing there. You're right. You talked a lot about the process. Now, what's it like to experience this? It feels very immersive, feels very multi-layered. This also allows you to kind of imagine your own sort of interpretation, because it's kind of, I guess it's sort of, it lends itself to imagination. Somebody described it to me today as it felt like it was recorded a little bit underwater, which actually, thinking about it now, acoustically, if you're doing music, that's a terrible sort of criticism. Your mix sounds really watery, or But actually, I took it as a compliment. I took it as a compliment because it was recorded under 3 or 4 layers of different atmospheres, of different acoustic spaces on top of each other, and he loved that because it reminded him water, which actually was, and that sort of memory about sort of the sea, which is a very prevalent part of this whole story, about, from the seafaring nation to also colonialism to empire to traveling the Atlantic Ocean, and all these connections of these different protagonists that we've picked along the way, from Venezuela to Likumi in Cuba to the Caribbean, to Randolph, to, across to England, Ireland, all across the Atlantic Ocean. So the ocean is an important part of this. So for him to have that feeling of the ocean is brilliant.
But it's not uncomplicated in its setting, because the house still, for some, their purpose is to come and see these 2 paintings that have never been displayed together before, and it was quite complicated to get the balance right of the sound being immersive, but not to
overbearing,
not to be overbearing.
Yeah.
As you say, sound is radical, and it is radical in space,
And
especially in museum spaces.
Big time.
And
What
for
reactions did you have from audiences?
there's been some really, I think one of the really important things that's come up is about the people who work every day in the space. And so, it was a very specific tactic for me that 2 of the people who contributed to it are people who work for the museum, one in a front of house role and one in an education role. And there is, there are people who are, in that team, there are people who absolutely love the piece, and it's raising the kind of conversations that they really want to have. It's actually amplifying the conversations they want to have with the museum. And as in a lot of the debates that are going on about in museums at the moment about, with the sort of financial cuts that are coming, the people who are most vulnerable. But there are other people who it's not their idea of what should be in a historic house with historic paintings. And I think,
exactly the reaction we wanted, really.
Yeah, I mean, going back to this political moment, that there is big stuff going on with the Secretary of State for Culture. It's a big issue about what a museum's purpose is, to tell histories.
It's amazing how bringing a bit of emotion into a space can make people feel radically challenged.
I saw one person who, they just sort of had a little dance. I think because the way that the installation with the paintings is, it's kind of been architecturally designed in terms of the paintings so that you have this sort of audience. So I think for some people it becomes quite a sort of private moment, for them to think, oh.
Yeah, I think it's that thing about sort of sound as well for me, where sound seems to then can animate something. You're looking at a static visual, and then you start to hear sound, which starts to give you a movement. It starts to make you focus on one area, and all of a sudden you're kind of dreaming, and you're making it sort of move. So it kind of animates the space, doesn't it? And apart from the fact that we're dealing with aspects of trauma, we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about empire, we're talking about who owns these artists, all kinds of things. But also there's a bringing in of another sort of plane of
taking that away from words. But you had a question.
Well, we have some questions on the chat.
Yes.
So Elaine says, Peter, the sound in the Barbican is wonderful. It really enhances the exhibition, and equally the soundscape in the Queen's house. Why do you think that the sense of sound is so often overlooked in exhibitions?
Good question. Why do I think the sense of sound is overlooked? Because I think museums aren't built to deal with sound, basically. They have the sort of surfaces are mostly hard surfaces. And really, for the curve gallery, I had to be involved in creating some different situations, like laying some carpet, like having a curtain in the space, as well as the exposed concrete, and I had to fight for the curtain, put it that way. It was sort of like, we don't have a budget, and it was like, well, no, we need to have a curtain. And why? Because there needs to be a breakup of sound, and people don't understand that sound is about not one material, it's about multiple materials interacting with each other in multiple angles, and there's little sort of work done on it, But why is there that sort of, why are museums interacting more with sound? Yeah, they're afraid of it bleeding into their spaces. They're afraid that somebody might not like it. It's radical. Sound is radical, and that's why I think museums, if they want to be contemporary, if they want to, get the attention of younger millennials or the younger generation, they need to look at the different senses that young people are involved in terms of absorbing information. Information shouldn't just be from one perspective. It should be, people have, in fact, different sort of abilities to absorb information in different ways. And it's actually quite biased just to rely on sound only, right? I mean, I'm sorry, visual only. There's people that also have other senses that are more heightened. It's actually quite, it's quite unfair to just rely on one method of absorbing information. It should have multiple different ways to bring in more different types of people who respond to learning, absorbing in different ways. We are humans. We don't absorb information in the same way as each other. And so far, museums think we all do. We're not all robots.
I think a lot of the work that I did quite a lot of work with Ravensbourne, talking to students, and it was absolutely across the board. We don't use text. It doesn't matter what you write on the wall, or what's on the label, or what's on your. That's not. I'm not going to. I respond to a space.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of the reasons I really wanted to work with sound, was to, move away from the word, of people looking at an object and expecting that there would be a label, there would be something there to give them the feedback. And I think that's it's a kind of interpretation balance, is accepting that the word doesn't work for everybody.
And also, I think sound also allows it to connect with the visual aspect or the artifact and the architecture. It kind of fills the invisible space in between. It kind of connects. All of a sudden, you start to look at the ceiling. Where's the sound coming from? It makes you explore the space you're in. That it's not just about the object. It's also contextualizing where the artifact might be from, which is again a problem with sort of, let's say, looting of artifacts, if you like. That what we could do is contextualize maybe that place where that artifact might have come from. Just to give you an idea of, instead of this kind of isolated glass case that's completely nothing to do with where this object came from, it's not real, and it doesn't have that feeling of where that thing came from. So I think sound is a really powerful medium that allows us to visibly connect these
it's a very literal thing about the 6 speakers that does that you're kind of thinking, oh, that's and that does break the space, so that you actually have to accept you are in this piece of architecture, not just a museum looking at objects.
You're recording a group or seeing it in their own space, playing it back. Sorry, I'm reading your question for the people online. And then they're playing it back in the Queen's house. And re-recording it. And then you're playing it again in the museum. So there's 3 spaces.
I'm not really sure what my question is, but maybe
which one is the most important space? Does it matter which space is more important?
Then you're not in just a space.
You're not just in one space, you're in everybody else's
You're right.
space.
I mean, when you finally listen to that soundscape in the Queen's Presence Chamber, it wasn't recorded there, but that's where the installation's playing. You're now hearing it with the acoustic response of the Queen's Presence Chamber. As in, the speakers are in this Queen's Presence Chamber, you're listening, and to get to your ears, it has to rebound through that space, right? So you're right, it's that final installation has gone through a lot of different architectural spaces, from your own home to this tulip staircase to the Great Hall, different materials. So it's actually quite a lot to deal with. I was crying when I was trying to edit this stuff And I was trying to tell Matty how much I was crying. When's it going to be ready? Tomorrow. 3 days of no sleep later. But it was a lot of play. I mean, I don't know, for me, a piece of work is sort of, the work also plays with me. I don't try and impose myself on a piece of work. I do, but at the same time, I'm so versed in what I do that I allow it to also grow and be natural to what it is. So I have to play with it. I have to experiment with it. And I have to let it kind of be what it wants to be and not fight it, but at the same time kind of just shape it gently. So it's a kind of, it's a really.
But there were some real like goosebump moments that it would just like as the sound came in, and you know there were points where you just sort of think,
yeah, that's working. Yeah,
that's good.
And making sure you don't mess that up. You know, from my point of view. But yeah, which is the most important space? There isn't one, but the great hall is the incredible space. You know, if you've been there, right? It's literally next door. It's incredible. The view of the Thames is a direct, you know, there's unobstructed view from inside the Queen's, the Great Hall. It's incredible.
It ruined the plans.
Does the view matter to the space? Absolutely. Spaces and views are very important. You know, it's sort of the light, right? Sound and light. I mean, this is the two most important things for theatre.
Light is very important in the building.
Light is incredible. So where is the light coming from? What is it looking at? You know, it's like the windows are like, you know, paintings, aren't they? What they're looking at becomes like a painting in this particular case, especially.
2 more questions online. So David W asks, he wants to ask about sound related to the archive, and in what way does this function of sound and the way that it seeps, does it allow us for a re-evaluation of the archive?
That's a brilliant question, isn't it? I like you. You're looking quite like, what's he talking about?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that, actually. He's talking about 2 things for me. He's talking about the archive and this incredible resources that we have, like, for instance, the sort of Greenwich Naval Museum or the museums, what they have in their archive, and how do you access those archives in terms of using, he didn't use the word bleed, he used the word seeping, which is very polite. So that's an interesting idea. I just have this thing about sound bleeding, and I kind of keep going on about it as my sort of little method. I don't have the answer to that, but I like the idea that you could be, how do you use sound to reactivate the archive is another way of looking at it. And how would you use seeping? Well, I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I wonder whether it also talks to this idea of control, that the archive is very controlling, and it's about ordering information in a very categorized way. And actually, the seeping of sound completely goes against that. You know, it is completely radical in that, and challenges that.
And trying to sort of connect things. The whole point of seeping is it's trying to connect things and not be contained, whereas you're right, archival by definition is containing in a specific space.
Separation, And we just have 1 more question from Rebecca Ford. She says, Peter, I'm fascinated by your process and how you respond to something, whether it's visual or historical, to create your soundscapes. What is your starting point? Is it different each time, or do you have a set of constraints in your working method?
I would say that it's completely different every single time. Matty mentioned that I was involved in a soundscape for a permanent soundscape for the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo, where I was told that the soundscape needed to be activated for 10 years initially, and then after 10 years, they said that the soundscape, as well as the whole, you know, installation, had to be there for 50 years, and that's a different approach to, you know, a different sort of piece like the soundscape for the Curve Gallery, which was specifically referring to, you know, an ancient civilization that actually was Afrofuturistic. So I was using in that one ancient African instrumentation, but also I was using a lot of synthesizers and synths and, you know, a lot of modern instrumentation as well as classical strings. So every time it's different, and this one was about voice, right? This was about voices, you know, in acoustic space and how to deal with a real acoustic situation, but also about communication in isolation and the problems with Zoom. I mean, halfway through the internet going down because everybody was using it at that time, you know, it was a whole different set of problems. But I love that. I'm a solution. I would say my main method is that I'm very much into finding solutions for things, and I love the idea of finding solutions for things, and riffing with experimenting how to find solutions for things. So I'm an experimentalist. I'm an improviser. And I'm very attuned to sound. I'm like a hyper bat. Sound just, for me, I'm hearing things. I'm walking through the stairs. I'm hearing the acoustics of that space. My brain just thinks in acoustic space.
Fantastic. Well, I think that sounds like a pretty good place to leave it. I just want to say another massive thank you to Peter and Matty for being here and talking about this incredible work. And I hope that we very soon get the opportunity to go and experience it in situ in the Queen's House.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be back open in 3rd of December, I think, the Queen's House.
And it's free, right?
It's all free. Yeah,
Yeah.
you have to book a space in advance because of the social distancing measures.
Fantastic. But thank you so much for being here and being a part of this Greenwich Sound Image Festival.
Thank you for listening.
Remember, for those of you who are interested in the rest of the festival, that we have lots of digital content online. Our own exhibitions, which have been shut due to the COVID lockdown, are being documented and loaded up virtually online in 360 degrees sound. So we have ambisonic recordings of those. So if you go onto YouTube, you can experience the full 360 immersion as if you were actually there. So please do check those out. Check our Facebook page and look out for emails with details of future events. Thank you so much to everyone who's joined us online, as well as everyone who's here in the room. It's been a real pleasure to be with you here this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you all very much indeed.